Welcome, everyone. Have you ever looked around at our modern world, at the relentless grind of exams, the factory like schools, the crushing pressure to conform, and wondered what went wrong? Today, we are going to dive deep into a profound exploration of this exact question by unpacking the insights from a brilliant synthesis titled The Hammer of Human Education, which draws heavily on the explosive philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a thinker who used his methodology like a tuning hammer. He tested revered societal institutions, not by immediately destroying them, but by sounding out the acoustic echo of their moral decay. We're going to take a journey together to understand how we got trapped in this hollow machine, and more importantly, how this framework offers us a way out to reclaim our true humanity. To understand what went wrong, we first need to understand what makes human culture truly alive. We can look to the structural pillars of vitality, represented by two opposing Greek forces, Apollo and Dionysus. Think of the Apollonian as the god of light, representing form, individuation, and the illusion of dreams. But then there is the Dionysian, associated with the wine god, which represents darkness, intoxication, primal unity, and the chaotic life force. Nietzsche argued that true artistic vitality didn't come from serene harmony, but from the collision and the synthesis of these two forces, creating epic tragedy. You need both the terrifying chaos and the beautiful form. Without Dionysus, art lacks vital lifeblood, and without Apollo, raw reality destroys the human mind. But this beautiful tragic life cycle, this perfect synthesis of chaos and order, was eventually killed off by Socratic rationalism. Socrates introduced the Socratic disease, an obsession with the idea that everything must be understood before it can be beautiful. This was driven by a theoretical optimism and rigid logic that fundamentally eradicated our unconscious instinct. By demanding that everything be consciously understood, Socratic rationalism severed the vital connection between chaos and form. It destroyed the protective aesthetic veil of tragedy, replacing the organic resolution of myths with artificial logical interventions. This obsession with absolute rational control eventually paved the way for what Nietzsche called the new idol, the state. The state is described as the coldest of all cold monsters, creeping with a lie that says, I, the state, am the people. Authentic culture used to be driven by spiritual elevation, organic myths, and the flourishing of the individual. However, the state machine replaced this authentic culture with institutional worship. The state is driven by a demand for absolute submission and homogenization, acting like a giant freezing factory that swallows individuals whole. How does this cold monster maintain its control over the youth? By forging the circulating coins through the genesis of the educational factory. The goal of education underwent a massive shift, moving away from spiritual self overcoming. Instead, the system was redesigned to produce standardized citizens who are merely useful, acting as circulating currency for the empire. Our schools became assembly lines where youth are subjected to state standardization to become obedient mechanical cogs. You aren't being deeply educated, you are being minted into a uniform shape to fit seamlessly into the machine. To ensure everyone stays in line, society enforces the morality of the herd animal. This is a structural drive embedded in our culture to eliminate all risk, danger, and profound suffering. It promotes democratic egalitarianism, treating everyone like sheep on a perfectly measured grid. This herd morality elevates comfort and herd conformity to the status of the highest moral virtues, while simultaneously demanding the absolute suppression of the Dionysian drive. If you have that spark of chaotic genius or raw vitality, the herd pathologizes you, flattening the exceptional down to the level of the mediocre. And who are the enforcers of this system? We can look at the concept of bridging epochs through the figure of the two-faced clown. The two-faced clown represents the pseudo-intellectual of our time. These individuals are supposed to be our cultural leaders and prophets, but in reality, They act as state-sanctioned technicians and apologists. They serve institutional power while simultaneously putting on a theatrical mask, pretending to maintain a critical distance from the very system they support. They make conformity look like deep, rebellious thinking. We experience this suppression most violently through the repression of exam-oriented education. This system represents the absolute assassination of the Dionysian spirit. Instead of embracing organic thought, which involves creative chaos, ambiguity, and deep humanistic soul crafting, the system enforces instrumental rationality. This means metric-driven compliance, standardization, rigid formulas, and a heavy reliance on rote memorization over true synthesis. Exam-oriented education fundamentally opposes organic human nature, brutally flattening the student into a metric-generating machine and stripping away all creativity and individuality. This metric-driven oppression extends even into the highest levels of learning, becoming the new eight-legged essay in modern academia. Just like ancient rigid testing formats, today's academic world is chained by state objectives and funding metrics. In this environment, the professor is reduced to merely a speaking mouth, and the student is just a listening ear. This environment guarantees the death of philosophical originality. Rigid metric-driven formulaic structures eradicate cultural vitality and true knowledge creation in favor of safe, circulating academic currency. This systemic burden ultimately trickles down to crush the family unit, creating immense structural anxiety and the phenomenon of accompanying study. Historically, education was an ideal pursuit for spiritual elevation, which then transitioned into a tool for social mobility. Now, in our modern reality, it has devolved into a desperate pursuit for meaningless employment survival. The sociological toll of this burden highlights the psychological deformation of the hyper-anxious modern parent. These terrified parents act as taskmasters, transferring the massive systemic pressure directly onto the backs of their children as they navigate a maze of endless test papers. To keep individuals from revolting against this pressure, the system weaponizes pseudo-nationalism and the eradication of dissent. Fake nationalism and collective unconsciousness are used as tools to wipe out critical dissent. As Nietzsche's Zarathustra observed, where the state ceaseth, there only commenceth the man who is not superfluous. However, within this system, the individual is encouraged to trade their personal responsibility for the intoxicating, dangerous warmth of the mob. You are absorbed into a giant, colorful funnel that grinds you down into a uniform, compliant mass. The ultimate tragic product of this entire institutional machine is the childman. This is the adult who refuses to mature. Instead of progressing toward autonomy and embracing risk, the childman surrenders all intellectual independence to seek absolute conformity and safety within the collective unconscious. Imagine an adult in a business suit, but with a child's toy block for a head, willingly stepping into a gray, featureless box. They have traded the heavy burden of independent thought for the comfortable managed cage of perpetual infancy. How do we escape? Nietzsche maps out a path of spiritual liberation, starting with Metamorphosis Phase 1, the camel. The camel represents the ethos of obedience. It is a psychological state of reverence, where the individual kneels down and willingly bears the crushing weight of existing traditional values, societal expectations, and standardized metrics. The camel operates entirely under the state's mandate of thou shalt. We all begin here, dutifully carrying the heavy baggage of history. But to remain a camel is to remain burdened forever. To truly break free, the spirit must undergo metamorphosis, phase 2, and become the lion. This is the phase of radical enlightenment, where the mandate shifts violently from thou shalt to a defiant I will. The lion is a fierce predator whose focus is entirely on destruction, extreme skepticism, and tearing down inherited idols. However, there is a crucial caveat here. The lion represents negative freedom. You can destroy the holobust and slay the dragon of conformity, but it cannot yet create new values. Transitioning away from the herd requires a specific psychological mechanism, the architecture of independent thought. When a stimulus like state propaganda occurs, the herd moves blindly in unison. Independent thought, however, requires a timeline of cognitive distance centered on the elongated pause. You must suspend your immediate reaction and engage in critical reflection. Only by standing still while the crowd rushes past can you produce a measured response and take authentic individual action. This cognitive distance is the foundation of Nietzsche's true education. True education is not quick, metric based instrumental training, but rather a slow, profound process of soul crafting. It requires learning to see, which means observing without prejudice and deferring judgment. It requires learning to think with relentless logical rigor, actively resisting blind herd instinct. Finally, it requires learning to speak and write, communicating with both Dionysian power and Apollonian clarity. When this true education is achieved, the spirit undergoes metamorphosis, phase 3, the child. This is the new beginning, marking the realization of the mandate I am. The child represents the synthesis of innocence and forgetting, possessing the joyous ability to create entirely new, self authored values from a blank canvas. This is the ultimate realization of the self overcoming human. It is the flourishing individual who is fully rescued from the institutional machine and is finally capable of affirming life. The engine driving this entire transformation is the ultimate driver, the will to power. Life is not simply about Darwinian survival, adapting to the environment, or remaining entirely reactive. Instead, life is an aggressive, expansive drive for self overcoming, domination, and creation. The will to power is the exact biological and spiritual force that standardized testing and the state machine attempt to eradicate. Embracing this active, expansive drive is what propels humanity across the abyss to become the Overman. However, we must honestly confront the abyss within this philosophy, the danger of elitism. Nietzsche's philosophy contains harsh, unforgiving rhetoric against egalitarianism and democratic movements, often viewing the weak as biological decadence. There is an intense, undeniable authoritarianism embedded in his push for the overman, sometimes demanding the sacrifice of the herd for the elevation of the blond beast. Historically, these concepts of the overman and the will to power were structurally hijacked, corrupted, and deployed as totalitarian weaponization by 20th century fascism. To prevent this philosophy from becoming a weapon of oppression, we must apply the dialectical antidote, freedom as a shield. While Nietzsche's political elitism holds inherent dangers, his radical demand for absolute spiritual freedom remains our most potent defense. We must use this inner spiritual autonomy as a shield against modern herd conformity and the crushing forces of institutional alienation. True freedom reconciles this tension, allowing us to forge our own paths without becoming tyrants ourselves. Ultimately, this entire journey is a calling for human education. We must leave behind the machine the twilight of the code monster, the herd morality, and the metric driven exam factories. We have a canvas ahead of us. True education does not forge cogs for the state machine. Instead, it is a genuine, soul crafting process, cultivating both the Dionysian spirit and Apollonian clarity. It cultivates individuals who are capable of standing over the abyss, thinking with clarity, and creating their own values. Thank you for joining me on this profound journey.